Time Cat, and I thought for my next vlog I'd talk about the Museum of London because it's closing its site in London Wall today. Between Barbican and St Paul's there's this big brown brick roundabout with Museum of London written on it. That's where it's always been while I've been living in London. So I'm sad that it's going to move. It is moving that far away, West Smithfield. But one thing I'm not so keen about that area is it's animal products where meat is sold. I'm not a fan of meat. I walked through West Smithfield yesterday after going to see the Museum of London with a friend, and it does really smell of meat, which I don't like. So that's one thing of West Smithfield. Sure, people eat meat. I'm not solely plant-based diet, but I don't eat meat. Anyway, I'm going off the point. So I wanted to talk to you about the Museum of London. I think it's an absolutely brilliant place. There's still going to be a Museum of London Docklands open at West India Quay in the Canary Wharf area. I think I'll be visiting that soon, but there won't be the current London Wall site, and that is a shame. So here's a summary from the top of my head, and well, I made a couple of notes about what I learned about the city I live in from visiting for the first time yesterday. It's kind of time travel. You start off, actually the first bit was something about a footballer. Can't even remember who that was. Not very interested in football. Gathered there's a World Cup going on between men, because there was a Women's World Cup in July, and now it's the men's turn to have a World Cup. So great, hope they do well, whoever wins. Might be England still in the running, so all the best. Back to Museum of London. Starts off with Roman times, Londinium, as London was called back then. Quite a lot of artifacts from that era. Then the medieval times, what's known also as the Dark Ages, when Britain was invaded by Vikings, Angles, Saxons. A lot of wars, a lot of hostility at times. I noticed lots of daggers and other weapons, some pottery, that kind of thing. And then there was the Great Plague. Came to an end in the 17th century when the Great Fire of London took place. I think that might have seen it off, but for a couple of centuries up until then, it was awful. It was brought in by rats and transmitted via clothes. Huge numbers of people died. Thinking about the coronavirus, but I think the Black Plague was a whole different scenario, a whole different scale of death and destruction. There wouldn't have been the hospitals or the medicine we had at that time. We wouldn't have known half as much. There's a few things like the sewer system which I've learnt about before, about how it's developed in London. Basil Jett, the family, I think, went on to making Big Brother, the reality television series. But back in the 19th century, sewers were invented that helped stop the spread of cholera and other awful infectious diseases. Anyway, going back to the Elizabethan era, things were gradually modernising. The Industrial Revolution, of course, that started around 1760, 1770 in Ironbridge in Shropshire, and gradually things changed by the 18th century, the 19th century. Eventually, the railways, in 1837, all the huge railway stations, Euston, King's Cross, and St Pancras got built in that era. Terminus stations all around London, and that changed the way we could travel so much further. Victorian shops, it was quite amazing looking at those. Hairdressers, barbers, clothes shops, grocers. So after the Industrial Revolution, Victorian shops, suffragettes, that was a really interesting time when women campaigned for the right to vote, and they did it in ways very similar to what climate change protesters have been doing more recently. They were often very disruptive, and they were often put into jail and released. And actually, another thing I've learned from outside the Museum of London is that cat and mouse tactic. There's a cat and mouse library on Camden Road going towards Holloway. That is interesting. There's quite a few things actually that there could be at the Museum of London. As you're approaching the final part, they actually ask what you would include. And there's quite a few recent things. I mean, everything from the tragedies in November 1987, the King's Cross fire, the Marchioness disaster in August 1989. One thing that was covered was the 7th of July 2005 bombings on the Tube network and the bus. It seems to be a testimonial to the people who lost their lives on that awful day. I didn't actually get a chance to look at that because there was someone reading poignantly. I thought I'd better avoid interrupting the woman who was reading through all the eulogies for the people who had died in that, in case she'd lost someone. So we'll go back to, so the First and Second World Wars. There's an awful lot about the Blitz, all the bombings, the awful loss of life, and the amount of sacrifice. The people who lived in London and elsewhere across the country and across the world, all the people who made sacrifices at that time. That's a very poignant part of the museum. Then from about 1950, London became a world city. A lot of the well-known symbols of London that we see, I'm not sure actually if I saw a black cab. Those have changed in shape recently. There could be quite a bit about. There's cycle schemes, the congestion charge, Grenfell Tower tragedy, and the awful terrorist attacks in London in 2017. Largely 2017, the Borough Market attack, the Westminster Bridge. There was another attack, failed bombing at Putney. There are quite a lot of more modern events that I didn't find anything from, but I did find a lot of interesting things about the Big Bang, finances, the changes to regulations, the way the city has built up. London has absolutely transformed in the number of skyscrapers, the number of tall buildings that are in the Square Mile, but also around Canary Wharf, Vauxhall, King's Cross, King's Boulevard, Granary Square, Lewis Cubitt Park. Quite an amazing area. The LGBTQ museum this weekend. There is some mention about gay rights, about civil rights, about the Brixton riots, some other less well-known protests. There's a chap who walked up and down Oxford Street who was known as the No Nuts protester, who was encouraging people to eat less protein, eat less meat, cheese. I think he believed a relative had died because of that, and he made it his life mission to try and persuade other people. The population of London has gone up and down a lot over the decades, over the centuries. It seemed to hit a peak in the 1930s, about 8.7 million. Towards the end of the period that the museum covers, 2011, it got back up to 7.9 million. Now I think it's actually nearer 9 million in 2022. We're actually probably at the largest the city's ever been. It's an amazing place. The final section was about grime music, the final section I saw. There was going to be a film, the museum stayed open overnight. I was a bit tired after 4 hours of wandering around the museum. So, and my friend was, and we decided we'd call it a night before the films were on. A film like Tony. It's a pity because it was a Q&A. Might have been interesting to see. I'm thinking of going back for a final bite of the cherry whilst it's at Barbican, just to see the place one final time there. I might pick up some more informational tidbits. So that's it. Made quite a long video, but thanks for watching. Bye for now.